chapters. Forest elders breathe their last.
Hey y'all, you're listening to the Ground Shots podcast, a podcast that explores our relationship to ecology through conversations and storytelling. It's Kelly Moody here, and I'm your host. You might hear crickets in the background and potentially a dog eating dog food and the sound of an RV buzzing. Thus is my life at the moment in Southern Virginia, where I'm recording this in my hometown. And I've been here since New Year's with Gabe, and it's been a long couple months, but the past few days have felt like spring is here. Yeah, it's been maybe 75 degrees the past few days, early March, which, in my hometown where I grew up, it is, zone 9 maybe. Not unheard of for March to be warm, but it's been just constantly raining all winter. I kind of felt like I just basically spent another winter in Northern California, except not living in my truck this time. But yeah, it's definitely, we've been cooped up and trying to work on projects. We renovated my little truck camper that I've been living in the past few years, basically fixing leaks, resealing the windows, like actually doing it the right way, and fixing some broken things like a doorknob that didn't lock, and repainting the outside and a bunch of the inside, and just really getting that dialed in. At some point I might sell it. Not ready yet. I know a few people have asked me about it online, if I do ever sell it, to let them know, but I'm pretty attached to that little camper right now. But it's been my home throughout so much travel and movement. The little space that I have that's consistent, it's just been a lifesaver at times. So I feel very grateful for that tiny little pod. And recently also acquired an Airstream. Apparently it's kind of the thing right now. I saw it in the newspaper recently. I think it was like a DC area, Washington DC area newspaper, possibly, that was speaking about how everyone wants a Airstream right now. And I didn't quite realize how popular they were until I got one for a good deal from a family friend, an older one that they did not want to continue to deal with and fix up. They're finicky, and older ones need some renovating and maintenance, and they wanted to upgrade to something else. So that happens. It's a really sweet space. So that's been kind of suddenly taking the forefront of my consciousness and priority. And Gabe and I were planning on working on a zine book type thing this winter, using all of the writings we did for the Colorado Trail and the plant lists. We haven't gotten very far on that yet, much to Gabe's dismay. We just have been so busy since we got to Virginia. When we were in our bell tent in Colorado, we were really resting at that time and just reading all day and studying and being internal. And then since we've been here, we've just been going, because being in Virginia in my hometown is not the funnest thing in the world. Like, I'm definitely grateful for it, but we're also just like, we're here to get these things done, for me to like get rid of a bunch of my possessions that are stored here, and to hone my apothecary down, and just stuff I haven't dealt with in a while. Get my truck inspected in the state it's registered in. That's a Virginia thing. We are going to spend spring and summer in Appalachia. I'm excited to see spring unfold in Appalachia. I'm still kind of trying to figure out where we're going to be, and we'll be renovating this Airstream as well. Hopefully being able to be in it by next fall. We've already seen beautiful plants coming up, crocuses and toothwort in the forest, and spring beauties, and even elderberries leafing out little baby leaves here and there, little baby yarrows. It's really sweet to see the tiny plants come alive and start to sprout. So a couple things before we get to this episode. Gabe and I hosted a wild tending and reciprocal foraging Q&A this past winter, and folks who attended it or signed up and could not make it should have gotten recordings for the class. I'm new to this Zoom class thing, so I had a couple hiccups just figuring out how to be best organized with it, but I'm pretty sure everyone who attended got the video and audio recording. But if you did not get to sign up and come out, the audio portion of the Q&A, which is about 3 hours long, we did go over, is in the store at ofsedgeandsalt.com for download. So you can always go there and download that, and it's there for you to listen to if you would like. We might do another one of those at some point, or maybe Gabe would host it solo. Sign up for the email newsletter that I put out every now and then. Maybe once a month or every other month I will do some announcements through email. I'll also kind of recap any new podcast episodes in case you missed any of them and give you a little more information about them. And sometimes I do a little extra stuff where I do some book recommendations or book reviews or other podcast reviews. So if you are interested in that, you can sign up for our newsletter at ofsedgeandsalt.com. It's there, the sign up form, or it will pop up at some point while you're on the website, and then you can sign up that way. Also, we've been doing an apothecary sale at ofsedgeandsalt.com as well since late February, and we're going to keep it open through the end of March until our walk. We have some stuff still in stock. We've sold out of other things. So if you would like anything, we have that stuff available now for folks to purchase. And then we probably won't reopen the apothecary shop for a bit, at least not until I figure out the next time that I can get it all together to do another one of those little shop updates. So grab something if you're thinking about it. Also, as a reminder, the podcast has a Patreon page, and I've had the Patreon going for a few years now. I've had it going since before the podcast, when I was doing a lot of research through the Ground Shots project. So there's a big backlog of content on there that when you become a member, you get access to, depending on the tier that you sign up for. And regular membership really helps us keep this podcast consistent and ongoing, and be able to take extra time to make it a good project to share with y'all. And we really appreciate folks who have been Patreon members. We've gotten some new signups recently, and I just wanted to thank y'all so much for the support of the podcast, and folks who have been supporting for a while now too. If you can't be a Patreon member, you can also support the podcast in other ways. You can give us a PayPal donation, like a one-time donation, and the links to do that are in the show notes for every episode. Another cool thing you can do is leave us a review on iTunes. I really like going and checking that and seeing if anyone left any reviews, and it's always super exciting when I see that someone did, and reading your words brings me great joy. And yeah, I check every couple days. I'm like, did someone else leave a review? Like, I want to read. So that's a really great way to get us visibility here on the Ground Shots podcast, and also sharing, word of mouth, sharing through your social media platform. When you give us a shout out, tag us, and we'll see it, and we'll try to reshare it if we can, if we see it. And that also brings us more visibility and gets more of the stories that we feature out there in the world. I also wanted to let y'all know that in some episodes coming up soon, Gabe is going to be doing some interviews solo without me. He's been reaching out to a couple people, especially in relationship to the research he was doing this past fall. I'll be introducing those conversations, but they'll be him. So that's pretty exciting. Get to take a break from being in the spotlight for a few episodes and give Gabe a chance to explore those topics and really get chatting with some of these folks on air. So I look forward to sharing those with y'all. So this episode of the podcast is another conversation with Téo Montoya. If you listened to episode 48 of the podcast, you heard a conversation that we recorded with Téo when he joined us on the Colorado Trail for a couple days, and we recorded it while we were making dinner and then breakfast. So after that conversation, Téo and I chatted again about it, and we felt like there was so much more we wanted to talk about on air with the audience, and more we wanted to go in depth with. So we decided to do a more formal interview online on Zoom, and also get a little bit more into what Téo does in the world, what his projects are. So Téo Montoya is a Lipan Apache writer, Indigenous futurist, electronic music producer, human design analyst, traditional ecological knowledge student, and educator. After completing his BA in Food and Medical Anthropology with a focus on indigenous diets and health disparities in Native American communities, Téo spent 5 years exploring the worlds of plant medicine, ancestral health coaching, DJing and producing music, information technology, working with a native-led nonprofit, and completing his human design training. As a writer and creator, he has begun the long process of writing a speculative fiction series and media project, imagining future worlds and societies built upon indigenous values, ideals, and cultures. Téo believes imagining the future, specifically a future grounded in indigenous knowledge and technology, will provide us with the solutions to meet the largest challenges to the earth and our humanity. Today, Téo lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico, writing, producing music, and supporting people on their personal and spiritual health journeys. All right, y'all, let's go ahead and get to this conversation with Téo Montoya. I really am excited to share it with you, so happy listening.
Every piece of wood I bring carries a story in lichen, fungus, beetles, maze. It's the same to you.
All right, so hi, Téo.
Hello.
Thanks for being on the podcast again, and this time more formally. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely felt like it was, I loved our conversation, but I was listening to it, I was like, oh, it's too candid a little bit. You know, I really like to get a little serious about some of these things too.
For sure. And also, there's so much that we talked about while we were out on the trail when you visited us that we didn't record, or like part of what was recorded was a tangent off of something we didn't record. So I think elaborating on some of the things that we talked about then here in more detail will be really awesome for the audience.
Yeah, I know that Gabe just would kind of sneak in the mic when he's like, okay, the conversation's getting good. He's just like turn it on to catch it. But yeah, awesome.
Yeah. Well, maybe you could start by actually formally introducing yourself to the audience and kind of what you do and what you do in the world.
Yeah. So Don Show, my name is, I go by Téo Montoya. I am Lipan Apache man of Texas, also known as Nde. So that's from South and West Texas. I am a man of many hats. I currently live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I'm attending IAI, which is the Institute of American Indian Art, for creative writing. I also have worked with the Cultural Conservancy, which is a native-led nonprofit and focusing on just indigenous community building, traditional ecological knowledge, farming, foodways, those types of things. I also do, currently my main kind of thing is actually with human design, which is a kind of sort of astrology system. So I do a lot of life coaching and readings there. So yeah, I got my hands in all kinds of different things. And I met you at a permaculture course, which with OAAC, which is Occidental Arts and Ecology Center, which partners with the Cultural Conservancy, because we're trying to do kind of a similar thing, but like an indigenous bent on permaculture. And yeah, I think, I don't know how, like, I don't think we were like talked a ton when we were in the course, but then something afterwards just kept getting drawn back and talking to you about little things. And then, yeah, that's who I am and kind of how we met, I guess.
Yeah, totally. I think that at that course, it was very overstimulating in some ways. And I was like wanting to talk to so many people, but often what ends up happening is that afterwards you just like intentionally keep connections, and it's easier outside of that pressured time to be like, hey, like, let's talk more. Now, like, I think then we ended up staying with you in San Francisco.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, a year ago, actually, we did that because my grandpa died, and that was a year ago. So. Crazy.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, it's been interesting. Both you and Gabe, I feel like we haven't known each other long, but I feel like a really deep kinship with you both, and excited for working with both of you in the future.
Totally. I'm curious, you just started a podcast, and I thought this would be a good way to kind of get into this conversation. It's called the Indigenous Futures Podcast, correct?
Correct.
Define what Indigenous futurism is, and then we can kind of expand from there into how that affects what you do and how you see the world. But your podcast is kind of focused on that, but also on the creativity that comes out of that. So will you kind of define that generally for the audience and how it influences your life?
Yeah, so adding to my hats, I would call myself an Indigenous futurist. There's no certification program or something out there. It's just and it's very much kind of a newly emerging thing, really sparked with Afrofuturism, and then us kind of using that model, but with Indigenous futurism. And so Indigenous futurism is just about thinking of the future and imagining the future and visioning and creating art that imagines a future in which Indigenous peoples and Indigenous perspectives are front and center, essentially. And so, when you think of Afrofuturism, everybody thinks of Black Panther. I think that was the first like really big media breakout of something that looks like that. And in Black Panther, there's a whole city that is extremely technologically advanced, and it's all based in African cosmologies and sciences and technology. And it's really something about just reckoning with the immense technological, cultural, and even spiritual achievement of Indigenous peoples, and how that is nothing to just like scoff at or to just kind of put on the side in a little romantic place and go, oh, isn't that cool? And isn't that neat? And just like, oh, look at them dance or something, like much of the early anthropologists did. But to go, no, these concepts have fundamentally already changed the world, and they are necessary. I 100% believe they are necessary to the future of humanity on this planet and other planets that we end up going to.
Yeah, I listened to all the episodes and thinking a lot about things that you said too while we were on the trail, and candidly recording somewhat while we were cooking dinner and stuff, and thinking about how tenets of Indigenous futurism seem vitally important for envisioning new ways of being on the land in the future and connecting with the land and being in right relations with the land, because we can't really go back to the past, but we can definitely use the wisdom of the past. I see a lot in like the rewilding and primitive skills community, this sort of romanticism of the past, though those skills are very important to keep up, but I was feeling really relieved by hearing how you expressed the role of Indigenous futurism and like envisioning a new relationship with the land moving forward. Maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I think one of the largest things looming over Native peoples today is both the need to hold on to our traditions in the past, because they quite literally have been ripped away from us, and that traditionalism is like part of our survivance, so it's necessary, and we have to like keep holding on to it because there's so many different things that are trying to kind of pull that away, whether that's just cultural hegemony or very specific acts of violence. But also we have to be able to move into the future, and we have to see Indigenous peoples in the future, and we have to remind other people that we're going to be in the future, and that the Western concept of the future isn't the only one. And so yeah, the traditionalism and the romanticization is like both internally backed up within Indigenous communities because it's necessary as part of our survival. Something we need to, revitalization of languages and cultures and everything is super important right now. But at the same time, the Western world also keeps us there because it's nice. And I was just thinking about because reading some of the questions you had sent me and just thinking about what is it about primitive skills, conservation efforts, people who are very inspired by Indigenous technologies. Why don't they sometimes get it? Why are they either caught in a romanticization lens or something like that? And I think it just comes down to context and meaning and cosmology, where they're accessing this information. One, because they come from a Western world, is mostly extractive, which is just kind of embedded in most Western thought. But two, because the meaning behind it is romanticized. That's the point, is that they're going back and they're becoming independent of larger conglomerations of power. And like those are valid, those are useful, but to go to be in the wild skills and like survivalist spaces and to learn Indigenous technologies to survive, but to not think about the future, or think about the future only in like a post-apocalyptic sense where like everything's shit and so now I'm surviving on the land because Indigenous people did this before and I learned from them. It's just it's lacking imagination. I don't know how to say it. It's lacking vision. And I feel like the main energy psychologically and physically that those people have and go towards ancestral skills, it is all based in these like doomsday, romanticized, individualist, sometimes communalist. And all of those are reactionary, as opposed to being like, we're doing this to, I won't say all, there's probably plenty of people who hold different ideas around there. Maybe you can speak to them, but I see that often, that's where they're coming from it. And really, I want them to come to it because they go, wow, these technologies are vital for the future. And not just the actual technology, like not just the bow drill, but like the cosmology behind it and the meaning behind it. That's the real technology. Because yeah, bow drills are great, but a lighter is better. Like, I mean, if you have access to it, it is better. It works better. It's faster. It's more consistent. There's no doubt about it. And if I have a lighter, I'm going to use a lighter. But what's the meaning behind it? What's the cosmology behind it? And I think that's the big disconnect, because regardless if it comes from a lighter or a bow drill or whatever, it's fire. It has spirit. It has a reason for being there. It's powerful. We have a relationship with it. And again, it's moving from those extractive models of Western society and moving into the reciprocal models that underlie all Indigenous thought and cosmology. So that's a longer rant, but I just had to get in there.
Yeah, having the skill without the context, sometimes there's something missing. But at the same time, I wonder about how that could actually be integrated into the skill sharing and the skill learning without being appropriative to, where someone's like, well, here's the story of these people surrounding this thing. I wonder about news stories and cosmologies too that somehow could hybridize out of that. That's part of the visioning of Indigenous futurism too, right? Is like, how can we envision those stories differently, and how settlers are integrated into that, because it's not like all the settlers are going to leave and go back now to the hybrid of countries and cultures they come from. Mm-hmm. So like figuring out how to integrate cosmology into skill sharing without being appropriative as well, and being respectful of Native people's stories. Yeah.
And I think when you look at Indigenous futurism, and I think so many people look to Indigenous ideas or ideas from any minority group, POC group, they're doing it, and I can't help but feel that part of it is due to a shame kind of oriented and performative justice oriented way, where they're like, oh, we'll talk about Native because we don't want to be shamed for using these things. And that's great. Reparations is definitely the best way to do that instead of just like land acknowledgement. But I think this is when I think about it, all of us are Indigenous. All of us come from someplace. All of us have a a seed of indigeneity that is seeking that sort of meaning. And I think that's why so many people are interested in indigenous cosmologies and indigenous thought and everything like that. And I'm just such a big fan of creating and indigenizing the process. And anybody can indigenize. And now I say all of this also knowing that that does not mean you disregard those who have specific connections to their lineages, those who have, cultural knowledge that they hold. Like, those people are always first and foremost, and we don't need people showing up and being like, I'm indigenizing things, and they don't have that narrative really to back it up. They don't have that history, they don't have that study even. But I do believe everybody can indigenize what they're doing. And so the second I think about those skills, great, put a history to it. Tell me where that came from, the peoples it had. If you know a song or something from those peoples, great, share it. Always, anytime you're sharing indigenous knowledge, bring it back as detailed as possible to the original peoples. I cannot stand when I hear people saying like, oh, it's a Native American story. I'm like,
oh God.
there's thousands like of different tribes and bands, like which one, which group, which area. So that, but then make up your own songs, make up your own story, make up your own mythology, have it tune into whatever your worldview is, even if that's a weird mix mash of Christianity and, paganism and whatever it is, but just make it have meaning as opposed to doing it out of, I don't know what, I try to think about what drives people to learn those things and use them. To me, it's all about the meaning. It's all about, I'm very comfortable in my life. Why would I go do this? I do this because it connects me with my cosmology, with my religion, with how I see the world, with my spirituality, and it's a skill. But that's first. And so I'm curious, like how other people come at it. Because that, to me, I'm like, that's what it should be about.
I know for me, I've gotten really into hide tanning over the years, which is definitely an ancestral skill, but it is a cross-cultural skill that people came to all around the world, which is really fascinating to really look into how people came to learning how to preserve animal skins, basically all over the world that didn't have communication with each other. Mm-hmm. It's kind of crazy. And the more I got into it, the more I realized that, like, my Nordic ancestors also tanned hides and skins, and the way that people did it is always slightly different in each place. Mm-hmm. And here I am in this place, and I can do it, in a conglomeration of the ways that people have done it, and whatever is available to me here. But it's definitely been something that over time I've looked more into. How can I find a connection to it through my own ancestry too, and learn about the history of that in those places, and how that moved through culture over time. And it's enriching to learn that and to kind of get that context rather than just having the skill and not really having any of that understanding.
Yeah, I think having that motivation of even just wanting to reconnect with your ancestry, that to me is more powerful. And I think that in the curiosity that most people have with ancestral skills and foraging and all those things, it is this kind of curiosity of, what was it like? And then to connect that actually to your own ancestry and own system of meanings or webs of meaning, that's really powerful and potent, and everybody should be seeking that, I think, because that's, accounts for the deficit of meaning we have in our kind of modern society.
I think there's a magic to some of the skills too. Like with tanning, the first time I ever did it, I was like, this is crazy that this happens. Like that my body is facilitating this thing happen. This like basically incarnation of this animal that the skin would have just gotten thrown in the dump. Like just the fact there's a magic there. And sometimes you're just like, is it, it feels like a spell or something. It feels like it feels sacred, and so I go back to it to like remind myself of what's important maybe too.
Yeah. And also we're so disconnected from the way things appear in our lives. Like, I have no idea this shirt I'm wearing, I have no idea where it's been, what it's gone through, where the the cotton came from. I have zero idea, nor do I think I could even like trace that unless I was really, really trying. And I think that that's where people are just, I mean, yeah, it's exciting to see, oh, that's how they used to do it. That's how they used to have it. I think a problem that comes up too is all the kind of Western, more Christian concepts of purity, and how purity is old, or like if you do it the old way, or the way that they used to do it, it's more pure. And somehow that's also ego affirming of like, oh, I'm doing it the most pure way, or I'm doing it the oldest way. Yeah, it's really fascinating. It also conflates with spirituality, which is really, yeah, super strange.
I definitely see that purist thing in the primitive skills community and the rewilding community. Like, are you premi enough? Are you doing it the most authentic? At the same time, I encounter this other way of how people see skills as dirty. Like, I come back here to the South where I'm right now, and like a lot of people around me, some people are really into it, and it's like a bridge, cultural bridge, but I see there's sometimes a sense of judgment that I'm doing something dirty, or like that because I don't want shiny modern things all the time. Like I have a computer, obviously I have shiny modern things, but I'm like, there's an interesting also dual thing of looking down on the skills too, while also there's the romanticism of purity in hand.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think it does really come down to relationship too. So like all of those skills you have, and even if you do them more pure, or like you don't use metal, or you use everything as primitive as possible, it still is actually creating more of a relationship. You have a relationship with all the tools, you know where they come from, you have a relationship with all the plants. Whereas if you use tools that were manufactured, you might not have that relationship. So I will say that there's that kind of inherent meaning, but I wonder when people are checking it out, experimenting with it, whether they're thinking about that, whether they're thinking about relationships with those, whether they're thinking about how that relationship adds meaning to their own life, and how that really is part of indigenizing, how just indigenizing our relationships and creating reciprocity, where we go, oh, I want to make sure this plant is here because I enjoy it. I enjoy working with it. I enjoy seeing it. I know it through all of its seasons. That is like the gateway, I think, to it. So I'm glad people are doing that, but I'm curious how much they're actually investigating,
Sure. Yeah. There's something else that you mentioned in the conversation that we recorded on the Colorado Trail, and we didn't really get to go super deep into it, and we had talked about it outside of the recording, but I kind of wanted to revisit it. That concept of transcommunality is something you brought up in context while we were speaking, and I realized when I was writing the show notes, I said we talked about transcommunality, but I also am like, did we really? Did we really? So I guess, would you sort of explain to the audience what that is and how that's important in all the things that we're talking about right now?
Yeah, so transcommunality was one of my professors at UCSC in like 2010, 2011 released this book, Transcommunality, and John Brown's Child, and he's indigenous, he's a Haudenosaunee, I forget exactly, or he's Iroquois, I forget exactly which of those kind of northeastern tribes he was part of, and he was also African American, and his concept of transcommunality is just kind of a ethic and kind of an idea for community building across diversity, as opposed to cultural hegemony being the only like motivator of mass amounts of people. And so really just at the central tenet of it, it's completely based around the Iroquois Confederacy, and just talking about we can be different and we can still work together, and we can acknowledge people's differences. We don't have to go to some place where that's off the table. We don't talk about race. We don't talk about experiences. We don't talk about context. We just try to create our own new context in a, kind of a hegemony, again, just something that pushes out our diversity so that we can be kind of in a pure arena working from there, because it's a little easier. It's less messy. It's less chaotic. But yeah, he has this whole kind of ethic around, how do we acknowledge where everybody comes from? How do we acknowledge all of our identities? And then how do we still community build and create social justice movements without, a bunch of shame or a bunch of, kind of separating out people, but calling them in, even through their difference. So that's kind of like the basic. And when you think about it being based on the Iroquois Confederacy, that's exactly what it was. It was a pact to work together. And it's not that they were, fusing, or like all the groups were coming together and becoming one, but that they were each their own. And even when you, I think something we may have talked about in the last podcast, but is my favorite kind of example of this on a certain level, is that a lot of the tribes in the Bay Area, a lot of the Ohlone tribes and Miwok, Coast Miwok, they shared earth renewal ceremony. So earth renewal, kind of like, you can think of it kind of like New Year's, where it's like every year they go to their most sacred place where they say the origin of the world began, and they pray and dance and gather for its renewal. And other tribes would go to other tribes' centers, like centers of the world. So they're every single mountain, most tribes have a mountain or a land that they've come from, or a lot of their mythology surrounds. And so they would go, yeah, this is our tribe and that's our mountain, but we're going to go up with our cousins up north and we're going to go do the same ceremony with them at their space. But I don't know why that's such a striking image to me, for people to like cross almost like religious boundaries and still be like, no, but this is me, but I'm also supporting you, right? And so that would be a good kind of very easy example of transcommunality. But yeah, just kind of how do we work together without putting away any of our differences? Even as Indigenous voices get louder in certain spaces and are heard more, how do we make sure that space is there and established, and none of the systems of oppression and power kind of holding that back? But then how do we also invite Anglo voices, back in, or immigrant voices, or any of the things? How do we invite them into the conversation and also share their experiences? And so I think we're at a really amazing formational time, especially in the US, where at some point we're going to have to start working together. I mean, we are and we aren't, and so right now it's a beautiful place to like reestablish power in all the places it needs to be reestablished, so people aren't having violence enacted against them. But at some point we have to come together and start building. And a lot of self-determination and sovereignty kind of concepts in Indigenous groups is necessary and needed, because we can't get swept away. We need to kind of establish ourselves in our own cultures and places and identities. But at some point, again, we're still going to have to build on a country level, global level together. And that's where I think transcommunality is really beautiful. And anybody who is not part of those groups that is really trying to reestablish themselves with power, you can start thinking in those lenses of okay, how do I not disregard myself and kind of do a martyr thing where I'm just I'm useless, let's focus on lifting these people up, which is, I like the idea behind it. But I understand myself enough, and I'm going to support them because they need support. I'm not disregarding myself. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Totally. There's a lot of dynamics within that concept that, a lot of things have been rolling through my head as you speak about it. First of all, I was thinking about how with a culture dominated by Judeo-Christianity is this, even though it's supposed to be church and state are supposed to be separate, there is this overarching sort of energy of Judeo-Christianity influencing this culture and also the domination over nature and people and all these things. But within that framework, there's often you're either right or wrong. You either believe exactly what I believe or not. Even within Christianity itself, you have the Protestants and the Catholics at each other's throats, or the Methodists and the Baptists saying, no, you're going to go to hell because you don't do this one ritual right, and you're going to go to hell because I'm you don't, that sort of, if you don't believe exactly what I believe, then you're wrong and bad. And I think that permeates so much of this dominant settler culture, and even in alternative activist circles and stuff, or people are trying to do the work to change how things are, I still see that kind of, if you don't agree exactly with how I agree, think about things. I mean, we all come from different places and have different stories. How could we possibly, but how can we also empathize with someone else's experience and story and not feel like that their difference is mortally wrong to our existence, you know, like just because they come from a different mountain doesn't mean that my mountain's wrong, right?
Yeah. And even in indigenous spaces where that narrative happens, I mean, that parallel, it's so funny, even like when you think about atheists and scientists and kind of that the rational mind and the objectivity, even objectivity runs parallel with like I'm right and you're wrong. And there's no room for, you know, connection, or there's no room for going, oh, I'll listen and I'll hear what you have to say and just hold that, as opposed to like, no, you're wrong because I'm an atheist, or no, you're wrong because that's not what the science says. And even in indigenous spaces, that those same Christian values, like 100%, I think even in atheism, they're just continuing. I don't mean to pick on atheists, but you know, kind of that rational minded, science oriented mindset is still just a continuation of those dualities of Christianity. And while they are like almost natural law inherent, like I definitely believe in the scientific method, there's also so much that we can't see there. And in indigenous groups, this happens too, because a vast majority of have been Christianized, and that's like a huge part of our cosmologies, and we can't like get rid of that. But yeah, that when I see that separating, when I see that kind of black and white thinking, you always have to look beyond what's actually happening and look at the emotion, because that's really what it's all about. And to me, it's all about power. It's like all about how are we managing power? Who has it? Who doesn't have it? And if I establish a black and white narrative, then I can take power more easily. And that's exactly this, that is why there's all these different sects of Christianity, because they were trying to hold power. And so they said, oh, you can't go there because that's the devil, or that group of Christians is completely wrong. And all of it were accumulations of power and trying to manage that. And that's why they made the black and white thinking. That's why they weren't open to having discussions or just holding that they believe something different without feeling attacked in their own beliefs. And I see that throughout literally everything, that kind of dynamic. And again, this comes back to, I think, a kind of extractive ideology that like, there's only so much power. There's only a limited amount. So I need to do whatever I can to take that back. And this is, at this point, I think using shame and guilt from underrepresented and minority groups is extremely effective, because the power has been misplaced for way too long. And we're living on a legacy of black and brown bodies that does not get acknowledged. And absolutely, we need to reclaim that like as fast as possible, because it's kind of central to the future of the world, I believe. But at some point, we do have to investigate like, okay, now how do we hold everybody's experiences? Now, and that doesn't mean that you should just sit by and let like a QAnon Trumpster like scream in your ear, but yeah, how do we really we have to think about that at some point, because we can't operate in this right and wrong reality all the time, because it is impossible to actually understand context of other people. I mean, or it takes a lot of work to unpack the psyches and unpack the, you know, why people do what they do and try to come to it from understanding. You could spend years in therapy or years investigating somebody and still not completely understand it. So instead of like trying to pull that apart, how can we just move forward together while acknowledging that and trying not to hate each other so much? I don't know, that's kind of a really roundabout way of thinking about it, but there's something there.
Being back in the South right now where I grew up, I've been really thinking about that a lot more, because it's the political climate right now is very intense. And in the South in particular, I feel like it's very intense right now. And just the energy in the air, I mean, in COVID, everything is just stressful anyways. But there's an energy of, you say, you know, in the context of like dealing with the power struggle that the right is trying to hold on to, or like white males, older white males or something, trying to hold on to, that they've always been given easily, and now they're seeing it be like leveled out, and it feels like something's being taken from them, right? So I'm here in this place where like it's like an epicenter of so much. I mean, there's so much that has happened in so many places, but for whatever reason, the South feels like this place where everyone's, the dominant sort of understanding of the world is still very rooted in impenetrable feeling, you know. But being back here, and this is a place where I grew up, and like it made me who I am. At the same time, it didn't, you know. I still thought for myself, still questioned things within being surrounded by all of this, you know. And I encounter people in the community that I grew up in that disagree with me, or we have different ideas about the world, and I'm always thinking about that, like, how can I avoid this interaction becoming like really not, you know. And I'm in this position of privilege too, because I'm like a white woman who grew up here, right, that I've gone and gotten educated. I've been thinking about this, you know, and like seen the ways that other people live, and like, you know, learned about other cultures, and like then coming back and trying to figure out how to, yeah, it's easier for me to access these people and them not immediately come at me with violence, right? Even though, you know, there's so many intersections to what that means, but it's still difficult, like, because, you know, someone gets triggered by something that they see as a challenge to their identity, right? Or their cosmology. It is really hard to know how to hold that and not be like, I need to go away now, you know. But that work is needed, that somehow that's being able to handle some of that space is needed in order to like find places to come together and find commonality, and maybe someone's perspective will be changed through that work. But it's hard. It takes one person at a time, I feel like, you know.
Yeah, and I always think about, especially with my human design work, there's always emotion in it. You're never, people aren't going to just rationally come to it, even if it's a rational, you know, string of inquiry. There's an emotional response, and everybody has to have that emotional response, and we have to collectively have that emotional response to actually get through it, to like see the other end, and then to go back and to evaluate. And I think I forget exactly the quote, but kind of a Jungian concept about just the energy of the psyche is really driven by religion and meaning and purpose and all of these things. And as our world has like stripped that away, partially in a natural response to them having too much power and like holding that over people and that being very negative, but now we're just like meaningless. We really don't have a purpose for being here, a vast majority of people. And so they find it where they find it. And that's where all of that psychic energy of like wanting to, being so intense against things that you don't believe in, or violent against things that you don't believe in, all that's just psychic energy, because that oppositional energy is now part of their meaning and their purpose. And when you think about even the insurrection on the state capitol, it's like all of those people were just, they felt they had meaning, they had purpose, they had belonging in their lives. I'm for sure not giving them a it's okay pass card, but that's what I feel like, that's what drove them there. Because I mean, think about how many people, and maybe where you're at, how many people what's their meaning about? If they're not Christian, like they look around, they're like, this is pretty shitty, or this is not working out so well. And then to find something that gives them that, and especially because anger is like it holds so much psychic energy, to lean into that. So I think when we see people who are super oppositional and creating all this violence, it's really embedded in that. But the psychic energy is the same. They just need to start investigating it, and they really need to individuate, which is a Jungian concept of like being able to go inside and go, what's here? Why am I feeling this way? Why do I want to do this? What is behind all of this? And I think that when you have good outlets for your psyche, you're not so oppositional. You can hold opposites pretty easily, as opposed to being like, I have to fight against this one thing, or I have to fight against this one thing. To me, that's like unformed energy, driven from a place that's really beautiful and innately human, of needing meaning, purpose, and belonging. Like we have to have that. And so like the loss of religion, great on some levels, also really devastating on some levels, because now we're in a world that people are getting easily manipulated, because, you know, either ads, marketing companies are pulling on that meaning and purpose and belonging, or conspiracy theory religious groups are pulling on that and creating these divisive spaces.
And then again, at the same time in the South, a lot of people are very Christian or religious in some way. I think predominantly Christian in some facet of Christianity, but there's something wrapped up in their thought process. I mean, because, you know, I think that all spiritualities have some good to them, right? The base of it, the core of it, the more esoteric part of it, there's some good in the thought of it. But, you know, the way they can get manipulated and used and how it did through time, and now it's handed to you on a platter. And, you know, a lot of Christian thought is like about dominating on nature, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this entitlement to land in that way as not a living being, you know. And I think what I see here is like there are a lot of people that are church tied, but also the land has been destroyed. The history of slavery here has like affected everyone's spirits, even people who act like that was the past, we should forget about it. And you know, it didn't, you know, even as a white person, that history of enslavement of the land and people is something I've really been thinking a lot more about lately. Being here affects everyone, and we're all chained to capitalism. You got to make money, you know, and then now, you know, capital at some point it doesn't work as well or it doesn't work as well anymore for certain people, right? When the power gets moved around too, like, you know, we have to offer job opportunities to everyone, not just one group of people, you know. For example, when that's your only meaning to work every day and be a cog in the wheel of this culture, and there's no connection to land, there's no connection to community other than through work or through this facade of like community through the church, you know, I don't know. I think that there's some, I can feel that permeating a place like this a lot, this sort of depressing disconnect from anything, you know. And then with the legacy of all the pain and stuff here that's like messed up so many things, like it's just in the air, you know.
I was nodding my head like crazy when you were talking, because to me that's just all of it again comes down to extractive principles of thinking that there isn't enough. And yes, but that's a very physical action, you know, conducted by Western thought and the colonial project. But it also, it's still part of that meaning and purpose and belonging piece too, that there's only a finite amount of that, and I have to hold mine and I have to share it. When indigenous cosmologies, that reciprocity with the land and with your, you know, your family and your community, that's the whole, that gives you all of the meaning, purpose, and belonging you will ever need. And that is why I think indigenizing things, even if you are not indigenous, you know, or don't want it, you know, you're far removed from your original homelands, finding that reciprocity, that's the medicine. That's like the thing that actually allows people to feel those things again. And it's right there. And then and there's an abundance of it. There's, as you know, there's plenty of work to do. There's plenty of things to tend, and there's plenty of things to steward. And so when I think of all these people in a deep deficit of meaning, purpose, and belonging in their life, and they're just trying to find that any place they can, whether it's like what online groups or, you know, through their work or through what they buy, all of these other things that have been set up to us because people make money off of it, because it's our exchanges, you could just turn that whole frame right back into reciprocal relationships with the land and come back into that very indigenous way of being with the land, where, you know, we weren't just living on the land taking. I mean, it's so crazy to me, as we've spoken about before, how like in conservation papers and in ecology papers, they like literally never state that this land is anthropogenic, that this land has been created by humans. Like, not all of it, not like every single plant has been planted by hands, but like it has been managed for thousands and thousands of years. And humans, I think this is like at this point, it's just a human career. You know, it's like wherever humans go, they do this because it's how they meet their needs. And to come back into that career of being human, of being a steward, of being a tender, all of those questions of power, all of those questions of meaning, purpose, and belonging, I think just go right out the window. we don't have to worry about them anymore. We have it. We have a community that's working towards a goal, and that goal is on not only our survival, but the continued just making life better and making life healthier. And so that's why those conservation concepts are just straight up damaging, because they remove us from land and remove us from relationship and remove us from reciprocity. And yeah, the land gets to look perfect and a big fire comes through because it's not tended, and then all the animals die and all the plants die and all the bugs die, and then it's really messed up. And then we're just going, oh, we got to conserve more, we got to do that. It's like, no, we need people on the land. And if that means changing it, if that means including invasive species, if that means planting some Chinese plant that takes over a whole area and knocks out some other things, granted, we should not do that. But if that is what is necessary for people to have a relationship with the land and to step into an indigenous cosmology that provides us all the meaning, purpose, and belonging we need, it's completely worth it. Because the most important thing is reciprocity. The most important thing is relationship. And yeah, if it's an invasive species, that sucks, right? That kicks out, it fucks up the whole ecosystem, messes with a bunch of other things. But at least there's a bunch of people on the ground caring for that land, and also not trying to make it just like get it back to how it was and being constantly a martyr about how everything's changing. And I see a lot of people doing that, stepping into that kind of martyr consciousness of it's all falling apart, the whole world is hopeless, I'm just going to focus on my little thing and try to make it perfect as it was before. It's like, that is, to me, that is a waste of energy when we can be tending to the land, living on it, and not just watching it die. Like,
it's interesting to me that like something like controlled burns on the landscape seems so foreign to people in the immediacy, or it seems damaging in the immediacy, but yet when I look out on the landscape right now and see like all the soybeans, that there's literally nothing else there but rows of soybeans, and the soil is like, it looks like sand because of how much it's been depleted. And I'm like, well, we see that as good only because it makes an income for that family over there, right? And that's the way that they see, they have to see that, they have to take that emotion out, or they have to shift their perspective because they're trying to survive, right? And they're making money off the land. But at the same time, I'm like, if we started small with like, people care about their home, they care about where they are in their family, right? If there's things that they do care about, how can you integrate small pieces into that? Like maybe convincing someone that their lawn would be better as native plants, and then they learn that maybe that their flowers are going to be more vibrant when they do controlled burns. And then suddenly they see how amazing that little patch is on their land, and they decide, well, maybe I'll take the part of my soybean field and put it into that now because it's so amazing. It feels good to tend the land that way, that there's something to starting with pieces and parts too, and that hitting some part of someone inside that like reconnects with that indigeneity, I guess, or like that sense of love for land. Because how can you not ultimately feel that sense of love for the land, somewhere in you, I guess. But I really think about that, like where, because you can't just convince someone to completely change what they're doing right overnight, right?
absolutely. This is where I really think about religion, like super often. But religion has this force because it is the cosmology that holds belonging, meaning, and purpose, right? Every religion holds that because that's really one of the most powerful driving forces of the human psyche. And so when I think about large changes like that, that's what I come to, is religion. But it's hard to even imagine religion outside of the Christian context. And so a lot of people have just super negative connotations with it, which is totally understandable. But that question of like, how do we get people involved? It has to be a religious act, because that's the point, And this is where it's really just like allowing indigenous groups and other POC folks, minority folks that have a closer lineage to the land than maybe some of the Western world does, allowing them to have the space and the power to do that. I mean, and again, not necessarily copying directly what they do, but also allowing them to develop the ideas that can answer some of these questions. And so when I think about giving, land reparations or land back for Indigenous folks, I think that's what it is. It gives them the opportunity to once again, be in their cosmology, because their cosmology is connected to that land, and then remake all of those connections and to see what happens, and to see what reciprocity brings. And so for the rest of the world that doesn't have those direct ties to indigeneity and their cosmologies that are built into the land like that, you really have to start thinking about how are they going to create a cosmology like that? Who's going to create it? And then again, be very critical of all the machinations of religion where one person wants to be the person in power, one person has to be the savior or something like that. But yeah, how do we invite people into reciprocal relationships and lands that are infused with spirit so that they can actually, that it meets all of their needs,
I think about people around here, farming is not very viable anymore, cash crop farming, ultimately. And I'm like, and it's far enough away from cities that there's not really like suburbs going in or anything, that this land is sitting there. No one's using it. I mean, the so-called wild is reclaiming so many places. I'm like, I think a lot of the people that have all this land, that their ancestors stole it, right? And they're sitting there and they're in this conflict of what do we do with it now? I'm like, they probably would rather see someone tending it versus it becoming a parking lot. There's something there, or versus it becoming a strip mall. Like, I do think that there's something, like, even if it looks different than how it was tended before, I do think there's something, I see that sadness in other places where, like, urbanization that doesn't make sense. That's a whole other conversation, is like urban planning and stuff. But like, where this one corporation owns this piece of land, so they're going to put the mall in this way, or they're going to put the parking lots in this way, and then it maybe closes down in 5 years, and then it's just sitting there. Like, there isn't like a connection to how the system works, right? That I see that in other places, claiming land or like taking over land that could have been used in a different way. And I think people who, I can see that in places like this where like maybe land back actually would be more appealing to them than strip malls, right? So I appeal to people's sense of connection to spirit through that as well. Like, what do you want to see here,
Yeah, and I think that that's what's so interesting, even with land reparations right now, where people are giving land back. Again, a lot of them are coming from this martyred shame, guilt orientation, where they're like, I feel horrible. I'm going to do good by giving it back and putting it in the right hands, right? And that's great. If that's what you want to do it. Please call up the close, figure out whose land you're on, figure out if there's any tribal affiliations there, connect that, go for it. But I really want to see, and part of what Indigenous Futurism is trying to do as well, is to go, these concepts of these cosmologies, things, all of these are technologies that are vital to our future. So I really envision people giving land back or creating these communal spaces in which Indigenous folks lead the way on those lands because they have the deepest connection with them. And they're doing it not out of shame or guilt or any of those type of, white martyr shit, but doing it because they're going, these are the best technologies. These are the best solutions. These are how we're actually going to fix the problem. This is how we're going to ensure the future of the earth is healthy and that we all survive and that my kids survive. Not doing it because I'm guilty, which I think just goes to show you that there's still this kind of thinking that indigenous ideas are not valid today and in the future, that they were only valid back then and that we far surpassed them and they've held no importance. Well, one, indigenous ideas are the reason we have the world as it is. Like most of our like foods that we eat are, anyway, there's like I can make a list of indigenous technologies that have affected the world that we're in today. But yeah, to look at it and go, those technologies are needed. We need to have song. We need to have connection. We need to have dance. We need to have community. We need to have cosmologies that are reciprocal. And we need to do those because those are the best technologies for the job.
Something we talked about a little bit on the trail that really also felt a sense of relief in me too, because I go to the ancestral skills gathering sometimes, or I'm like interested in these skills that, you know, where I see people being very purist about the skills, but I find myself in multiple worlds where I'm like using computers and learning tech stuff and like figuring out how to dance between all these different types of technologies. And something we kind of talked about on the trail a little bit and on the last recording with you is sort of the place for modern technology in Indigenous futurism and in the future, and how can we have a good relationship with that. And some of the things the way you expressed that before, I was like, right, like that, you know, just because this computer is really complicated and is 10 steps from like the earth doesn't mean it isn't important or that it doesn't have a spirit behind it. So maybe you could speak to like that concept, because I think that's something that's not talked about enough. So
Yeah, and actually the next, maybe not the next podcast, but I'm interviewing one of my old kind of boss at TCC, and he has this whole document he's been working on called Rebalancing Technology, and it's really talking about this. And so you always have to start with the question, what is the difference between survival technologies, ancestral skills, and this mic that I'm talking into right now? Like what's the difference? It's similar medium, you know, we're you know, story and talking and all these things are necessary, right? You could teach ancestral skills with it. And the only difference is reciprocity and is relationship. We don't know where this came from. We don't know where it was mined. We don't know who built it. You know, all the ancestral skills, that's immediate. You know that right away. You're the one doing it, or you know the person who did it, who gathered those supplies and brought them. And relationship is the first part. So even now, as we're like completely disconnected, I mean, I'm sitting at an IKEA table. I have no idea what wood it's made of. I don't know how many chemicals it's had in it. You know, I have no connection to it whatsoever. So I think something that is here to kind of, again, put our psyches into that relationship without even necessarily having it physically, right? Because I said like this psychic motivation, this is what's needed first before we can actually start trying to create those direct relationships, is creating a relationship with it. You know, I always go back to the hand axe. And hand axe is one of these technologies that just spread throughout the world so quickly. So quickly, if we look back, and between multiple humanoid species, there's hand axes were shared. And it wasn't a bunch of people coming up with the same idea at the same time, it was shared. And you have to think about the kind of religious awe that early humans had when they got given a hand axe, and they're like, holy shit. Like I can, you know, strip skins with this, I can build things, I can manipulate my environment, right? And how that was almost a religious act, or that's how I like to imagine it. It's not like they're like, oh, that's cool, we'll use it. It was probably imbued with meaning in some way. That's why we see pictures of it. That's why it changed culture itself. And so when I think about technologies like this computer and stuff, yes, I have no relationship with it. How can I create one? Right? How can I look at this computer or an urban environment and create an intimate, reciprocal relationship with it? You know, I write about this often. Is like, how can I dance on my street corner? You know, this place that has nurtured me, and it's covered in concrete, but it's nurtured me for parts of my life. I have community there, I have belonging there. How can I speak to that? How can I identify that meaning and let it sink in, let it get into my psyche and go, this is amazing that you're here, you're part of a legacy, you've helped build this, what this is. Because truly, when we think about technology and the feats of humanity, I mean, there's some venom against it because all this bad stuff has happened as a recompense, but it's totally awe-inspiring. Think about 200 years ago, if somebody were to see what we've built, it would just be like, they would lose their mind. They'd have no idea how to deal with it. Why does it mean nothing to us now? Or the places that it does mean, it's all about the money, or all about, you know, maybe some accolades, like, yeah, I'm the architect who did this thing. But it has no kind of spiritual connection. So part of reconnecting and part of Indigenous futurism is reconnecting with technology and creating context with it, creating relationship with it. So like literally, like saging off my computer before I sit down to write, talking to this thing because it's a tool that is so valuable to me. It has a spirit. It's made of all of these sacred minerals and metals, and so much effort has gone into it being created. So I need to reckon with that. I need to sit with that. I need to investigate that, right? So I don't have this perfectly figured out, but it's part of thinking about how do you create a relationship with it? One, so it doesn't control you, so you understand what it's for, so you understand why you use it, so it fits in a context of what it's here for, as opposed to it just controlling you by showing you everything that you think you want and all those algorithms. So having intent with it, and then also just building a relationship with it. And I like to think about, like, cameras are super fascinating because a bunch of different indigenous groups often feel like it's stealing the soul, or it's so outside of what we should be able to do with reality that it's like not okay. And I just like thinking about how do we honor that, and how, as me as an indigenous person using this technology, even going against some of my tribal elders and how they think about using this technology. Like, I've definitely gotten the slap on the hand trying to record a conversation that somebody else said was okay, you know, and going against that, but then going, we're going to make it meaningful. It fits into our context, and it has an honorable spot. This is this spirit that is capturing. I know that might sound really funny to people to say something like that. This is the spirit that's capturing, but part of the way that we make meaning and religion in our life is anthropomorphizing things and giving them meaning and imbuing them with spirit. And yeah, okay, it's just a hunk of metal, but it also means something. It becomes symbolic. And so what's the symbolism we're experiencing, and how do we work with it? And how do we weave it into a system of meaning so we don't have to, so that the only system that is pure is one where all of this is removed, where we have to go back. That's the other issue with, like, land back. If you just give land back to indigenous people, guess what? Some of them, they don't have the manpower, they don't have the resources, they can't take control of that land because of forced removal, because of the reservation systems, because of food insecurity, all of these things. They can't even take care of it. So that also speaks to that we need this modern technology and modern tools to start working with the world again in those, contexts.
I think using these modern tools as points of connection to, I mean, I see how, like, say, the Capitol event that happened, it happened because of the use of this technology, of people being able to gather, and even the QAnon thing, and is because of some mysterious person, entity out there putting out these downloads or whatever. There is like this weird new digital space that things create identity and disperse identity with. Story sharing has always been a part of being human in some form, right? And so we can also use these to tell stories that connect us just as much as it's used as a tool to separate people or to divide or to, attack or whatever. And I think for me, I'm always thinking about how can I keep in mind that I can use these tools as a point of connection and to get people to say, okay, I'm connecting and now I'm going to go out on the land,
Mm-hmm. We just have to think about technology. All of it comes from us. It all comes, everything we create, getting into that technique and all of the skills that we hold to create things to manipulate our environment, all of them come from our brain. All of them come from our psyche. They're just a reflection of that. So to think of them objectively as like removed from a meaningful spiritual space is to completely reject that in our own minds, which to me is just innately human. Nobody exists without some sort of web of meaning or purpose and spirituality, whether or not that looks very grand or just kind of very simple. But yeah, so when you think about those technologies and all the things that they're being used for, and all the things, all of that is just a reflection of what is going on in the psyche of individuals and collectively. And so the same way that we would investigate our own motivations and our own internal workings, we have to investigate how we use these instruments, these technologies, because they're just a reflection of that.
We can't be human without technology. Then that's like a fact that, like, without the using a stick in the right way, we wouldn't have had fire, and without fire we wouldn't have had the nutrition that we had, and we wouldn't have the bodies that we evolved with, and the tools that we've created as humans to figure out how to feed ourselves, clothe ourselves, you know, make shelter and connect with one another, to do art, like all of these things. We wouldn't be human without those. And when you study sort of the philosophy of technology and thinking about how people divide technologies into like good and bad in some ways, like at one point does the axe evolve into something that connects you? I mean, the axe is like in direct contact, right, with like the wood that it's chopping or whatever it is that it's doing. But at what point, I think it's really subjective ultimately, and really how you approach it isn't. I used to kind of have that more dualistic thinking about it, like, and that's where I think a lot of the like rewilder skills folks are coming from too, is like, these are good, these are bad, you know, but at the same time, people are coming together because of the internet, you know, people are connecting with each other about the skills because of the internet or because of podcasts or whatever. So it's like, it's all part of it, you know?
Yeah, it's like facing the collective human shadow of why these technologies are bad. You know, and I think that having this kind of death drive for apocalypse so that these technologies are gone and survival technology is the most useful is like a huge lack of imagination of what we can do with these once we're in right relationship. It's just the fact that we've created something that now controls us, and because we've lost all relationship with it, and it's become so abstract, it's no longer in that kind of anthropogenic archetypal realm anymore. It's just like a computer is a computer, it's subjective, it does this thing, but I don't have any relationship with it. And so I think for ancestral skills people, really thinking about why are they driven to that, especially if they remove the apocalypse death drive, which is totally understandable. I get it. If they can remove the apocalypse death drive, why are they drawn to it? What does it do for them? How does it enrich their life? How does it make them feel? And that exact feeling, that exact kind of drive, if you can clarify that, start looking at all other technologies in the world. And then you can start being responsible for them. Then you can start being responsible for fossil fuels. Then you can start being responsible for fair trade and where these things come from and who's being enslaved and abused to get them, right? Instead of just going, that shadow is so immense, it is huge, it is so much pain and suffering, it is so difficult to reckon with. I'm just going to say, fuck it, it should be blown up, and then I can go just do what I know to be good, right? And I don't even, like, that's a little bit, you know, I totally understand too, like, that's a lot to deal with. I have no idea how to fix that. I have zero idea, but I am imagining a world in which things don't need to be destroyed for it to be fixed anymore, where we can take responsibility and work towards, which my personal philosophy is, we're here to be stewards. That is why we're on this planet. We're here to create life the very same way that we've been created. And that can extend past our planet, that can extend past our solar system, and that can just continue, and we can become the very creative force that created us. So how do we get in alignment with that creativity? And how do we use everything that we have in service to that, as opposed to creating these black and white spaces that allow our psyches to relax a little? Because it's super immense to think about. I hate thinking about all the violence and difficulty in the world. I have no idea how to fix it. But I'm going to imagine a world where we're not in that space anymore, so we can start taking steps towards it. And that's what futurism is all about, specifically Indigenous futurism and utopian thinking even. Sometimes it's not pragmatic, but sometimes it's the only thing that can release us from this structure we find ourselves in now.
So you're working on, I don't know how much you can speak to it because I know it's a process, but you're working on some creative projects. One is like a book, right? And the other is some sort of multimedia Indigenous futurism project. Can you speak to either of those and how they're connected to some of the things we're talking about and where you are with them?
Yeah, absolutely. After working at Facebook, which is like, talk about an abstract system that has very little meaning in the world, but is still very powerful and a powerful tool, I really was trying to understand that kind of question of like, what kind of religious or spiritual or meaningful belonging purpose experiences do we need to get in line? Like, how do we transmit these types of really archetypal ideas? How do we get them out there? How do people start thinking this way? And especially not making it like a cult or using the leverages of these people are bad and we're good, so now we can move forward, like using that energy, right? And it all comes down to good story. Like, I'm obsessed with Star Wars. Like, I fucking love Star Wars, and I've loved it my whole life. I got more into it after college. I'd read all the books, and I'm just so completely compelled with the adaptation of myth, because mythos and our creation stories as Indigenous peoples and all of these things, they are the very material in which we create the cosmologies in which reciprocity and belonging and meaning and purpose is all there. So to me, the most important thing we can do is create stories. We can create mythologies, because these speak to those things that are inside of us that we haven't investigated. You know, all of those people who just go out and do violent acts, it's because they haven't investigated who they are, what's happening, why they are experiencing that, why they're angry, why it might be personal, might be collective. And story is a way that we can, without going to a therapist, think those things, experience them. I mean, when you read a book, you become the person, you see the things, you vividly hallucinate, kind of, you know? And so for me, that's where I was like, I started with anthropology, medical and food anthropology, working with Indigenous groups. And you could write research paper after research paper. You can get little grants from the government. You can do all of that. I don't know how that is very important work. It doesn't do enough for me personally. And so that's when I really started looking to story for the mythology aspect and speaking to the archetypal, because a good story can convince people. My life literally changed after reading Dune. Like, that book blew my mind, seriously. And it was just the way that we think about psyche, you know, and I'd never seen that done in a book before. And I just saw the power there. And so I really started thinking, like, I want to write sci-fi. I want to write fantasy. Not because I'm just, you know, I'm definitely a nerd, but not because I just like it, but because I see the value in it and the way that it speaks to our humanity without being so on the nose or being inflammatory or being, you know, creating these divisions or pointing fingers or any of that. It just speaks to being human without specific examples. And so I think Octavia Butler has done this extremely well. Her work, she's an African-American artist who I don't know how else to say it, but she's an oracle. You know, she's prescient. She's seen into a future. And that's where I really saw the power in it, that she's speaking to human stories in a future, and it is potent, and it rethinks how you think about the world. So I really was attracted to that idea, and that's kind of why I started. I was like, yeah, I think actually creative writing is the most effective thing to do this, even though it's not direct. And I often think about what are our places in change. And, you know, for me, I'm sure I can take a step into more activist spaces, frontline spaces, but for me, that has never called me, you know? And so this visioning and creating story that, you know, we need bards. We need people who are sharing story, who are part of these movements. And I think that that's something that I love people who are like that, and I want to step into that. So I created this story. It's a huge alternate history epic spanning different thousands of years. And all of it comes down to the central thing of responsibility and reciprocity. And that's the major theme of everything that I write, is like, what is necessary? And the book that I'm working on now, which is also what the multimedia project is part of, is like the multimedia project is part of some of the stories and focuses on one of the characters and is kind of a themed thing. The biggest story is what responsibility, or how do we psychically prepare for terraforming a new planet? How can we ensure that when we step foot on that new planet and we begin to make it, you know, to colonize it, that we do so with reciprocity at the forefront, where we recognize the consequences of all of our actions and the deep need for meaning and purpose and belonging, and not doing it in any sort of extractive sense. And so it's an experiment in what is it going to take for not only individuals, but for groups, collectives to get there. So that's what it is. It's a thought experiment that ends up having characters who have romances and live human lives. And yeah, that's what I'm working on. And that's why I think Indigenous Futurism originally started as kind of a writing and artistry. And it's because it's allowing us to envision what is possible. Yeah, it doesn't really get applied to the world at this moment, but we've always needed seers. We've always needed prophecy speakers, because prophecy, I believe that, fantasy and sci-fi and fiction are prophecy, and the more connected we are to the collective current, the more we can speak to what is possible in the future. And there's no difference, like Octavia Butler, between being a fiction writer and being a prophecy speaker. And they're very much the same thing, because what we imagine may come true, especially if we get enough people invested in that vision. So that's what I love about Indigenous Futurism, and that's why I really want to focus my life on doing that myself, and then hopefully getting other people to join in the visioning, and to get out of the apocalyptic doomsday death drive and into sort of what is possible when we consider everything that we hold,
There was an intro to one of Ursula K. Le Guin's books
Mm-hmm.
too that spoke to just like, hey, just a reminder that this is a story that isn't about right now, but in some ways maybe it is okay to let it allow you to rethink what's happening right now. But the freedom that comes with story and sci-fi and fantasy of imagining worlds that might be taboo too, or imagining things that might be taboo according to today's culture, and allowing it to be an entity is something that's interesting. Like, what does it do once it's an entity and we allow it to be, and now we can let that permeate our world,
This has been happening all of human history. Our mythologies, our creation stories, they create the world. They allow us, these beings that can manipulate the world, that are humans because we create technology, they give us a reason to do it, right? That's what a cosmology is. It's a story about the world. And even fiction writers, slowly or rather quickly, some of their narratives become part of the cultural zeitgeist. They become part of our culture. I mean, I'm reading Neuromancer right now by William Gibson, and like, this dude had never touched a computer, and he just imagined the internet. He imagined these futures that are very dark and bleak, but at the same time, it just spoke to what was possible. And now his language that he came up with is everyday language. We use it all the time. Cyberpunk, and anyway, there's like a million other examples, but it's just that exact thing that I really think that we're at a deficit for story. And that again goes back to this kind of rational world being like the most important thing, because it's pure, again, following in the steps of its Christian origins, that anything outside of that, and that we don't have psyche, and that we don't have abstract experiencing, and we just can objectively view things, even though our objectivity is framed in a context that's completely abstract and cultural and all of these things. We have to wait for everybody to vet why we do things, and it has to be completely objective. It's like takes a lot of steam out of the sails, because the steam comes from the psychic experiencing, the archetypal, the abstract, the symbolic. And yeah, I think we're going to see more and more. And something I often say is that people who are obsessed with conspiracy theories and are just taken by these concepts, I'm like, y'all need to read some good fiction. You need to read some good sci-fi. Y'all are just bored. You just need you need to think about the world. And they get so excited, because that's what story does, because that's what it is. Conspiracy theories are stories. Like, how exciting is it to think about the world as being a hierarchy of lizard people and percentages of blood, and we were created by aliens, and there's multiple dimensions of living? That's exciting. That's super cool. Like, I listen to that, I'm like, damn, that's dope. I want to play a game that involves all of that, right? I want to be in that world. But it's a story. Like, can we take it back to its archetypal symbolic? And I think that is the most distressing thing, is that we're so removed from the symbolic, the archetypal, and the abstract world that we start making it real. I mean, that is collective psychosis, because we have no frame of meaning and purpose that holds us. We often talk about that technically a lot of shamanic thought you could think of as extremely mentally ill or having a lot of difficulty in the world today, but it had a context, and it had support, and it had community, and it had a completely different lens of how they worked with it. Because mental illness is part of being human, right? So anyway, going on a tangent, but yeah, there's something there.
I was just thinking about how books as a technology, like it's a super modern technology of taking story and then the evolution of story into written language. And then now we can publish, just like that whole story is crazy, like how that technology evolved and how now we can put story into these little compact objects that we can carry around with us. And there's been periods in my life where I don't read as much and I feel like I don't have time to read, or like the way that our current technology influences our psyches and like attention span affects our ability to focus. But I find when I do pick up books again and start to like let myself be basically like tripping, you imagine the worlds when you read. It's not that hard to like to shift right back into that place of wanting to be in the story and wanting to be affected and taken by it. And that is something I think really ancestral too. And that modern technology, right? Like that is connecting to something old.
Absolutely. I mean, I just always go back to, if you have the privilege of having parents or elders that told you stories when you were a kid, sometimes you'd be bored, but then sometimes you'd be so enthralled. I'll never forget all my dad's like ghost stories and just how enticing it was. And I think that even now a lot of us may read fiction or people are, I'm a little bit of a hater against people who only read nonfiction. But I think with even reading fiction, I think there's still a disconnection from it. There's still a disassociation from your own experiences while you're reading. And so people don't take in what it's archetypally speaking, just get larger than life. Everybody reads them. It's not just because it's like a good character, and it's not just because it's like a cool premise. Like those are all important. There's millions of cool characters and cool premises. It's because it speaks to something that is inherently human, archetypal, symbolic, and it might not be saying that directly. Oftentimes, not saying it directly has more of an appeal. Even it becomes like it's sort of mystical. It's kind of like, why does this make me feel so good? And I think that oftentimes we read fiction without considering that or thinking about that or going, how did that book just change me? How did that book make me think of things differently? We just read it, put it down, pick up another one, or don't read either of those things.
Yeah, I think any kind of art form too can do that.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's
Absolutely.
just, it's often symbols that are being used, or these sort of parallel spaces that make it almost easier to interact with than like it being directly about right here and now, that influence us.
Yeah, that's why I think just the arts in general, I mean, they're the reason they push our capacity to imagine. And so that's why the second we lose the arts, we lose the like breadth of how much we can actually imagine is possible and what to do. I mean, they're like thought experiments, they're like think tanks in a between pages or in a song or in somebody's dance. They're just information that we can use to apply to being human, and I think everybody benefits from it. But then now we're also getting on the edge of like attention culture and like creating things that are super enticing but don't actually speak to anything deeper, or maybe they do but very just anger or just sex or just, which those are fun, great, I enjoy them, but
Yeah. Instagram and TikTok and Twitter and all these, Facebook, like there often it is very like quick, like have your attention for 15 seconds, move on, 15 seconds, move on, or 30 seconds, or maybe 3 minutes, move on, visual and audio, but a lot of it's very visual. There is some magic and possibility there, and I do think that it becomes a place of connection for sure. And there's also something about it too that is only on the surface, again, that dualism that can, or the multifacetedness of how technologies can be. We don't really know where it's going and what it's going to end up doing with our brains and like our ability to connect or collectively imagine things. But I can see that there's good and bad, obviously, in those.
Yeah, I think the first thing for imagining a future is coming into right relationship with it, because otherwise it's totally going to change us. I mean, every technology we create even changes us. I mean, like you said, fire and all of those things actually physically changed us, and it's going at such a speed that we will evolve or will implant something that helps us evolve quickly enough to work with it. But we just have to make sure that we're leading that charge, that we have intent and we hold responsibility for the technology, instead of just going, oh, that's a good idea, I might make some money off of it, let's go for it. And then it just completely changes the future of humanity. It has to be somebody 3 generations down, somebody's responsible for it, as opposed to the person creating it, because their intent and their worldview and their cosmology wasn't invested in reciprocity, it was invested in extraction and just making money. And I think that's the fallout we see now, is like all of these innovations, all to make money, all to optimize, all to in the service of capitalism. Now we're responsible for it, which is a responsibility that we have to take on.
There's something else we talked about on the trail a little bit, and I know that we've been on this for a little bit, but I feel like before we part ways, we should at least talk about it a little bit, is the idea of like, what is the right way to land tend, or what are the right ethics for, say, something like wildcrafting for non-Indigenous people. And we dabbled in that a little bit while we recorded that conversation. And sort of sometimes what Gabe and I think a lot about is like, when is it okay to be hands-on and when is it better to be hands-off? And like these philosophies that swirl around in our world too, like with conservation, it's often hands-off. And maybe that's not always a good thing. Maybe it is a good thing sometimes. And you spoke to that some in that candid recording, but maybe you could elaborate more on it, because I know that when we talked about it afterwards, you're like, oh, there's so much more I wanted to say about that. So do you have any thoughts you want to share about that?
Yeah, and I think I kind of referenced it early on. Of course, when we're talking here, any opportunity you have to create relationship with Indigenous folks and the first peoples of where you are currently living, invest time in that. Support them as a community. That's the best place that you can really start. I think anybody who's interested in ecology and conservation and any of those things and land tending, that's the best place you start. If you're lucky enough, they might even teach you. They might even take you through that. But don't go there expecting that, please, because that doesn't, you're not going to be happy. But yeah, investing in the Indigenous communities is always first. And of course, if you are going about land tending, trying to get permission to do so is always important. And there is places where it's really hard to figure out who lived here, or where are the traditional peoples, or they were moved 300 years ago from here, or 200 years ago. So how do we, so there's a lot of complication there. But my strategy for land tending goes back to, it's all about the relationship. I would, as many people that want to create a relationship that is based in reciprocity, that is based in long-term observation, please do it. Go for it. I think that is the biggest problem, is that people are afraid of the backlash, of the shame, the guilt for doing something wrong, instead of taking full responsibility. Or they do the thing, which I've talked about, where they're saying like, oh, we'll just give it back to them, which is a nice sentiment. And it's really, I agree, like land back for sure. But a lot of times those tribes don't have the resources to manage that land anymore. Maybe they don't even have the cultural knowledge, and it's going to take a period of revitalization to actually start practicing those things again. Having land is essential to that. But also don't wash your hands of it because you're like, oh, well, the Indigenous people will take care of it. Right now, we want Indigenous people to take care of it because they're the only ones who could do so in a reciprocal way, right? So as land tenders, as stewards, as wild foods folks, as harvesters, as people making livings off the land, I still think that there's a healthy way to do that, and that you can give to the land and receive from the land and have a reciprocal gift exchange essentially with the land, and still be able to make ends meet, still be able to educate. In fact, we need more people doing that, because the reality is we live in a capitalist system, but you can't just do that willy-nilly. It takes commitment. It takes work to do it in a healthy way. But I'm still just a believer that it's hands-on. Like, we need people on the land. When we were doing that walk through Colorado, the whole time we were talking about like, okay, all these trees are dying, some either a bug or a fungus, okay, fire's going to come through at some point, who's going to be here, what kind of techniques would they use to reforest it? Would they get a bunch of people out and planting new plants that bring in a bunch of different new species, or what would they do? And it's this weird like hands-on way that is really damaging, because all of these ecosystems have, like, we've not been around long enough. The reality is that white settlers have not been around long enough to know, or been paying attention long enough to know how these ecosystems act. And oftentimes the stories of ecosystems are held in not only creation stories, but all kinds of other stories of indigenous folks. They go, yeah, there's a time 1,000 years ago where all of this burned, and these plants left, and this animal came in, and this place changed. And that's in the story. So they have this knowledge of what's happened. And we can lean right into that and go, what's going to happen now? Because the world's changing again. How can we prepare for it? How can we invite it in? How can we have a relationship with it, as opposed to trying to stave it off or to fix it up and make it in the image of peoples who have no relationship with it? It just does not make sense. Like, it doesn't make sense for a ranger to travel 1,000 miles and reforest an area and they don't even know what it's like, or to have a bunch of people do that. I believe hands-on is the best possible solution. I think conservation just straight up is a sham, that it is a way that people are trying to work with the earth, and I think it's going to do more damage in the long run. Although it was vital to actually protect, like, love John Muir, because I'm just like, thank God he got people interested spiritually even enough to go, we should keep these lands, like, we should stop trying to just log them or tear them down or mine them. So I'm like, super thankful for that work, but now we have to do more than that, and the other thing is that, like, again, I think it's just a lack of imagination and a lack of just being like, yeah, it's gonna be hard. We have to figure out all these problems. It's not going to be worth money, right? It's not going to be valuable in today's society, but we have to do it, or the doomsday death drive people get what they want. Totally. So yeah,
there's a lot to that. And being someone who's interested in herbal medicine and wild foods too, it's always like a dance I feel inside of myself of, like, with whatever being I'm interacting with, or maybe I'm harvesting these wild greens to eat, what's then the next thing I do that's reciprocal in that? And sometimes it's very obvious and sometimes it's not. There are certain plants, like white sage, for example, that, like, maybe I could collect seeds and replant them or something, but like harvesting it to resell is not great. So it's like, it really depends on the situation. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes we make it more complicated than it needs to. And I think something that you and Gabe, and specifically Gabe's wild tending work, is just so potent, is that he just collects seeds, and he collects bulbs, and he collects things, and he replants them, and then he eats them, and he replants them. Like, I don't know why it's so hard. And then there's plants that you can't do that very easily. And it's no surprise that a lot of cosmologies, a lot of indigenous cosmologies, certain plants have, they're anthropomorphized. They've been given an identity. They've been given a spirit. And you go, yeah, you don't mess with that one. Or you only pull that one during this time, or only this certain person can take care of it. And it's because that person or that time or that thing created a relationship with it that ensured its survival. And also, there's nothing wrong with making our ecosystems useful, right? But nearly everything has a use. And even things that we don't have, like, that is like immediately, like, it's medicinal or a food, often in indigenous cosmologies, they still had a purpose. They're still part of a creation story. They're still part of something. And so everything gives, whether that's food or medicine or story, or is part of that meaning circle of meaning, purpose, belonging, all those things. And I think that we just make it really difficult by trying to replicate perfectly, like, some ecosystem, as opposed to experimenting with it. Do you really think experimenting with an ecosystem is more dangerous than either cutting it down or just letting it do its thing? I think that experimenting with ecosystems is going to produce results that are healthier for that ecosystem and us, because it partially creates this reciprocal belonging, meaning system, and because it continues to live, it continues to thrive, it gets input, so it does output. Whereas conservation, how long can that last? When is that ecosystem no longer going to be applicable at all? There's nothing wrong with making the ecosystem useful. I read today, somebody was like, you got to go get the vitamin W. You got to go be in the wilderness, and it's such an extractive way of being. Like, it just kills me. I'm just like, do you know any of the plants? Do you know where you are? Do you know who, it's like, there's no relationship, whatever, but they're getting their vitamin W. They're getting some wilderness. So like, I'm like, yeah, build a parking lot. If you can ensure that those people who are utilizing it, who are going out there, build relationships, that they understand the land, that they want to invest in it, that it makes meaning and purpose in their life, but that it's not extractive, that it's reciprocal. So there's a lot of inventive ways we can do that, but we also need guides. We need people who know the land well enough to introduce other people to it. There's places on this planet that nobody knows anymore. And we have to rediscover, somebody has to put in the effort, and then hopefully they can share that. But yeah, the vitamin W thing, oh my God, killed me. I was just like, cringe.
Well, Téo, how can people find you online? Because you have your podcast and then you have social media presence. So yeah, how can folks find you to learn more about what you do? And yeah.
So you can definitely follow me on Instagram at teomontoya.nde, N-D-E. And then I have the Indigenous Futures Podcast, which at some point you all will be on that, I'm sure. So those are the two main places. I also do human design work, but it's kind of a whole different bag. But yeah, just Instagram is pretty much the only place I really exist right now. I've kind of taken a break from Facebook and don't have a website or anything. So yeah.
Well, thanks for being on the podcast again. I know after we did that informal recording, we were like, we should do another one where we really get specific and like focus. So I'm really glad we finally made the time to do that, and I'm excited to share this conversation. There's still so much more about each of these pieces that we could get off into other stories about, but
yeah, I'm so thankful too. I'm really thankful for you and doing this work, and Gabe doing this work, and yeah, so look forward to spending some more time together in the future.
I know, some in real life time together.
Yeah.
Great. You just listened to a conversation with Téo Montoya, and the interstitial music for this podcast was also by Téo Montoya. Don't forget that you can support this podcast on Patreon at patreon.com/ofsedgeandsalt. The link to our Patreon page and other ways to support us are always in the show notes of every episode. The theme music for every Ground Shots podcast episode is Sweat and Splinters by Mother Marrow. Happy listening. Until next time, y'all.
Forest elders breathe their last. I'll bring them for your supper. Every piece of wood I bring carries a story in lichen, fungus, beetles, maze. It's the same to you, all ablaze. When you burn, burn with the light of the morning's birth. Burn, burn with the heat at the heart of the earth. Burn, burn with the light that reveals our faces. Burn, burn with the heat that will warm these places. Some